So I was just thinking about a couple of things too. When I started, when we had to close the mission, the second week was, of course, the Hydesville Day, was our Hydesville meeting. So I did a bit of a correction to the history of Hydesville. But I was thinking about it because what we see now, mainly in spiritualism, are mental mediums working, people who connect to spirit and bring over the information that those people are, those loved ones are there, giving sufficient evidence and proof of the relationship, and then the message from the person using the classic communicator evidence, reason for coming, and tying the message up. But of course that wasn't anything like what went on most of the way through the whole of the 19th century up to the 20th century. And one wonders, you know, how they got on. They were these people sitting in a cold house, a cold cottage in New York State, with all these rappings going on, not knowing what the hell was going on, and then finding that people were communicating. And as I said at the time, I don't particularly, in the end, place that back with the Fox family, because the Fox sisters did establish the contact, but in fact they left the Fox cottage in the evening the rappings first occurred, and the rappings carried on for the next 7 days, mainly with committees of neighbours taking reports, and they made the communication. Unfortunately, it's quite interesting. I was thinking about it. What I never said was they blamed the man. It was suggested the man who'd lived there previously had committed the murder, but the actual people who attended all wrote a character reference on the man saying that couldn't have been. So one of the classic parts of mediumship. Maybe they got half the message, but we didn't get the bit we really needed to get, which proved the whole story. But that's where it came from. And I look back at it now and I think, well, it's a pretty strange thing for people to run into. And it wasn't really the first time Spirit had attempted to communicate, because Spirit attempted to communicate on numerous occasions. And there are a number of places you can run into this. There was obviously in the early 1800s, late 1700s, there was a huge interest in ghosts and ghost stories. And many of those ghost stories are really, when you look at them, attempts by Spirit to communicate. You've got the story of Wesley and the Epworth Priory, where they had a ghost that was rapping on the wall. And for a time at Epworth, Wesley did start to communicate with it. But of course the church, the traditional church, didn't want that to happen. So he in the end ignored the spirit that was communicating and just left it. Prior to that, there's a classic case. I wrote all these for an article for The Ghosts of Christmas Past for Psychic News, way back in 2009. There you go. The Ghosts of Christmas Past. And there was a drummer, Ted Tedworth, and this was a lovely classic case. A magistrate arrested a drummer who was making a nuisance with his drum, confiscated his drum and sent him to jail. And then he kept hearing drumming in his house every night. And at first they thought it was somebody doing it and nobody could find the drum or anybody else. And then at one point he started trying to communicate with the language. This is back in the 1660s. And his rector, finding out he was doing that, said, "You can't do that." So they came up with means of removing the spirit. And there was one where a group of people ran around the house with swords out, jumping in the air and stabbing, trying to kill the spirit. And then when that didn't work, what they did was they grabbed loaded muskets and they ran around the house firing the muskets up into the ceiling, trying to kill the spirit. And in the end, the knocking I think the spirits just gave up. Obviously, they were never going to be shot or stabbed, but it was getting a bit risky. Somebody might have found a way to kill them, so they gave up. And I was looking before I came to it, there's so many stories of attempts to communicate in the past, and there's a reason why I personally believe New York State was chosen. If you type in anywhere, New York State, the burned over district, you'll find a bit of history about the religious frenzy and the second great awakening of religion in America. And it all happened in New York State. Everything possible happened in New York State, because in the 1840s, one of the major ascension movements occurred. The Millerites, Andrew Miller told people that God was about to arrive and Jesus was coming and all the rest would be killed, and they'd better be ready to be raised up to God's kingdom. So everybody sold their property, gave everything away and got prepared, and nothing happened. Amazingly, the Millerites didn't die out. Like many of these movements don't die out. They became the Seventh-day Adventists. We know they haven't died out. The Mormons appeared in New York State. The miraculous tablets were discovered there and decoded in New York State until in the 1850s they were given permission to move to Utah. So that started there. Christian Science had its foundation in New York State. The Jehovah's Witness are the same. So it really was the place you went if you wanted to do something different. Even before it started, the Universalists and the Unitarians were very strong there, both of which believed in, neither of which accepted the idea that Jesus was a saviour. They didn't agree with vicarious atonement. And of course the Swedenborg, which I know Fred knows more about Swedenborg, but Swedenborg's new church, which Swedenborg didn't want a church founded, but 20 years after he died, they founded a church anyway. And the new church was quite strong in there. And a man who was influential throughout spiritualism's early days and way beyond was Andrew Jackson Davis, who was the Poughkeepsie seer, who started his mental medium, his magnetic mediumship, which is trance mediumship. People put into hypnotism to create a trance which allowed them to work. He started doing that in the 1840s. And he became very influential in America. He formed his own organization in 1848, about the same time as spiritualism started, and created the Declaration of Spiritual Independence. So if there was anywhere where spiritualism and spirit would have a chance to communicate, it was going to be New York State, where so many places could actually appear. And it didn't really come entirely as a shock, because I mentioned magnetic mediumship. Before we had mediumship which involved spirit, we had mediumship by created trance, by magnetism. And amongst the people who were quite famous of that in France, the Didier brothers, who could read through an envelope and give messages from an envelope sent by somebody. In the 1840s, a man received a letter. One of the Didier brothers was put into trance. He put the letter up against his head, and he said, he'd been asked the question, "Can you tell me what the house my son lives in looks like?" And then he said, "Well, I can't tell you that, but I can tell you tomorrow morning you're going to get a letter from your son telling you to come to his house. He's seriously ill, but everything will be all right." And the next day the letter turned up and he rushed off to his son. So there were a lot of things going on in play. We'd had Anton Mesmer creating the concept of animal magnetism. Anton Mesmer stepped further than that. He was pre-Napoleon. He created the first padded room, and he created a crisis by hypnotism, put people into that room and tried to get them to have their crisis in the room where they could throw themselves around against the walls without hurting themselves. And from that came a development through a man called Pusiga, who started to find if we put people into trance, they could find they had different talents, the ability to sense things through a paper. The seeress de Provence at the same time could lay a book on her stomach, and in trance she could read the book as it was lying face down on her stomach. So everything was going on at that time, which was, if you think about it, is astonishing that we had all of those developments going on, which all came together in spiritualism. You will now find people do psychometry. Psychometry is sensing energy. It's working very much in the way that these magnetic mediums did, holding a scarf and picking up information from the scarf. Nothing to do with spirit. It's not spirit giving the information. It's the individual holding the object, connecting to the energy of the person. doesn't go very far adrift from dowsing. People know I'm a dowser. I love dowsing. I dowse the Earth's energies to see whether what I can do if a house isn't working properly. That is about energy. We imprint ourselves on the land. I can sometimes, if you go into a house, you'll know, you can sense the energy if there's been fights in that house which have gone on forever, and you walk in. Maybe you walk into it blind when you're trying to buy a house, and you suddenly sense you don't want to be in the house. It's not necessarily anything to do with spirit. Quite often when I'm house clearing, I talk to people and say, well, I will look at spirit as the last option, not the first option. I'll always look at the way the energies lie through the house, whether there's underground streams, whether there's any influences being placed on it. You can sense if somebody's sending negative energy at a place. You can actually notice where that's coming from and make sure you can shield it with crystal. So it's quite fascinating when you're doing that sort of work. And that's really, it's just something we do as we learn and before we take that step to become a mental medium. It comes back to being the mental mediums we are now. But all of us, as I've proved before, I'm waiting for Tina. Looks like she's having trouble waking up. For those who don't know, Tina, it's 4:30 in the morning in the UK for her. So I'm amazed she's on. Yeah, we've come to that through all of those years. And sometimes I think people forget that there's a lot more behind our history and how we got to where we are now.